Clara? The name cracked from Alexander Pierce's throat like glass under strain. The clatter of silverware, the laughter of wealthy patrons, the warm buzz of the Friday night crowd, everything froze the instant his pale blue eyes locked onto her. His hand, still resting around the stem of a champagne flute, trembled. Olivia's laugh stalled on her lips. Clara Johnson stood across the dining room, tray in hand, a swell of her 7-month pregnancy pressing against the crisp black uniform that was already too snug. Her braids were pinned back neatly, her posture straight, her chin lifted. She didn't flinch when she saw him. She didn't even blink. Only her hand shifted slightly, instinctively brushing her stomach as if to shield the life within her from the weight of his gaze. The silence stretched too long. A waiter behind her bumped into her elbow, muttering an apology. Clara moved gracefully aside, tray still balanced perfectly, and began walking toward a corner booth. Her steps were measured, every movement deliberate, as if she refused to let him see the slight heaviness of her swollen ankles or the ache in her back. Alex? Olivia tilted her head, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light. Do you know her? Alexander's jaw flexed. His throat worked before he could manage words. She used to work for me. Olivia's lips curled, a predator tasting blood. A maid? She turned, her voice rising just enough for nearby tables to hear. Your maid is working here? Several diners looked up. Whispering drifted like smoke through the air. Clara set the tray down at her table, the clinking glasses steady in her hands. She didn't so much as glance their way. But the heat of Alexander's stare burned against her skin like a brand she could not escape. Alexander Pierce, the millionaire, Olivia said louder now, smirking. Served tonight by his former maid. What are the odds? A ripple of uncomfortable laughter scattered across the room. Alexander forced a smile, though his cheeks burned. He leaned back in his leather chair, running his fingers along the rim of his glass. Enough, Olivia. But Clara had heard. She straightened, tray now empty at her side, and walked past their table. For just one fleeting second, her eyes met his. They were deep brown, steady, unshaken. She gave him nothing, not anger, not shame, not even recognition. Only silence. And somehow that silence roared louder than any accusation. Behind the kitchen doors, Marcus Hayes wiped sweat from his brow as he plated seared salmon. His gaze darted to the server window just in time to catch Clara passing by, shoulders taut. He noticed the tremor in her hands when she reached for the next order. He noticed because he always noticed. She had once been the girl who sat beside him in Sunday school, scribbling dreams of opening her own bakery on scraps of paper. She was the one who laughed in the rain with him when they were 12, who cried behind the bleachers when her father passed, who disappeared for years into quiet servitude in someone else's mansion. Now she was here, belly heavy, dignity heavier still. And he saw, clearly, what no one else cared to see. She was breaking inside. At the table, Olivia twirled her fork idly, eyes flashing mischief. So she worked for you. Why fire her? Did she burn your shirts? Forget to polish your shoes? Alexander didn't answer. His throat tightened. The memory of that afternoon at his estate clawed up his chest. The laughter of his colleagues, the mocking remarks about how comfortable Clara looked in his kitchen, the way he barked at her to leave without explanation. He had told himself he was protecting his image, but the truth was simpler, crueler. He had fired her because it was easier to humiliate her and to confront the insecurities her presence stirred in him. Now, watching her glide between tables with unyielding poise, he realized something terrifying. She looked stronger than he had ever been. Clara delivered plates to a family in the corner, her smile soft and practiced. A little girl at the table pointed at her belly and asked in a whisper if she was carrying a baby. Clara crouched slightly, resting her tray against her hip, and whispered back, "Yes, sweet pea, a little one who loves peach cobbler as much as I do." The child giggled, and Clara's face softened for the first time all evening. Alexander saw it, and it pierced him. Evelyn Carter, the restaurant manager, swept past Clara with her usual briskness, clipboard in hand. "Johnson," she said curtly, not even glancing up. "Table 6 needs refills. Let's keep up the pace." "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied evenly. But as she turned, she saw Alexander rising from his seat, Olivia still smirking at his side. He was walking toward her now, deliberate, as if drawn by something he couldn't name. The dining room air thickened, conversations dimmed. Alexander stopped just short of her, his polished shoes gleaming beneath the golden light. For a moment, the man who never faltered looked like a boy caught in a storm. "Clara," he said quietly, too quietly for the crowd. "We need to talk." Her fingers tightened on the tray. She drew herself taller, belly forward, shoulders squared. "There's nothing left for us to say, Mr. Pierce," she murmured, voice steady, though her heart hammered inside her ribs. And with that, she turned, walking away before he could respond. Alexander stood frozen in the center of the restaurant, the sound of her footsteps echoing like a verdict he wasn't ready to face. "Unbelievable," Olivia's voice carried across the restaurant as Alexander lowered himself back into his seat. "She just dismissed you. A maid. Pregnant, no less. I can't decide if it's tragic or just hilarious." Alexander didn't respond. He swirled his wine, staring into the crimson swirl as though it might explode. In the sharp ache in his chest, his mind wasn't on Olivia, it was on Clara's refusal, her refusal to look small, to look broken, even when he had reduced her to that once before. Olivia leaned forward, lowering her voice, though not enough to prevent nearby diners from catching pieces. "What kind of girl gets herself fired and ends up waddling around here, serving us?" She gave a quiet, cruel laugh. "I almost want to ask if the baby belongs to one of your drivers." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence gave her permission to go on. At that very moment, Clara walked past again, balancing a tray of steaming bowls. Olivia reached out and let her manicured hand brush Clara's wrist as though stopping a servant. "Oh, darling," Olivia cooed with mock sweetness, "be careful with that belly. We wouldn't want you to drop something and make a scene." The words were barbed, dipped in poison. A few guests snickered into their napkins. Clara paused only a heartbeat before steadying the tray against her shoulder and replying, "Don't worry, ma'am, I'm used to cleaning up other people's messes." The air cracked. A few diners gasped softly, others grinned behind their menus. Olivia's smirk faltered for the first time. Alexander's hand tightened around his fork until the metal bent slightly. He didn't know if it was anger at Olivia or at himself. Back in the kitchen, Marcus slammed a pan harder than necessary onto the stovetop. He had heard the exchange through the swinging door, every word echoing like stones against glass. "Keep your cool, Hayes," muttered another cook, slicing herbs at the counter. "She doesn't need you rushing out there." But Marcus couldn't shake the fire in his chest. He had watched Clara endure enough in her life. Her father's death, the endless string of menial jobs, the condescension of people who thought her worth was defined by her uniform. And now this. He glanced through the service window, catching sight of her returning to the kitchen, her tray empty. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled as she set the tray down. He noticed everything, and what he noticed most tonight was that Clara was near breaking. "You all right?" he asked gently, just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't look at him. "I'm fine." But her voice had that brittle edge he knew too well. Out on the floor, Alexander tried to focus on Olivia's prattle about yachts and fundraisers, but the laughter of the room had shifted. It wasn't with him anymore. It was circling around Clara. He glanced at her again, catching the way she smoothed her apron over her stomach, as though protecting her child not just from hunger, but from shame itself. A memory flashed, her hands folding his shirts with meticulous care, her humming softly as she dusted the piano, her silence the day he cast her out like she was nothing. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something foreign press against his chest. Guilt. Later, as Clara delivered wine to another table, Olivia deliberately extended her foot into the aisle. Clara's balance wavered for a heartbeat, the tray tilting dangerously. Gasps rippled through the diners. Somehow she steadied it, setting the glasses down without spilling a drop. But the humiliation wasn't lost on anyone. "Oops," Olivia said, feigning innocence, lips twitching. "Silly me. These heels are so unmanageable." Clara met her eyes. Calm, controlled, but her knuckles were white against the tray. The restaurant's hum had changed now, tension seeping like smoke. Diners leaned closer to one another, whispering, watching. Every movement in the room seemed pulled toward Clara, her silence, her dignity, her refusal to crumble. And in that silence, Alexander realized something that made his stomach twist. The crowd wasn't laughing at Clara anymore. They were beginning to laugh at him. In the kitchen, Marcus finally threw down his knife and muttered, "I can't just stand here." Clara turned sharply. "Marcus, don't! She's mocking you in front of everyone." Clara's voice dropped, weary but firm. "Let her. People like Olivia, people like Alexander, they only have power if we let them see us break." Marcus studied her, chest heaving, fists still tight. Then, slowly, he unclenched his hands. "You shouldn't have to carry this alone." Clara gave a tired smile. "I've carried heavier." She pressed her palm against her belly, eyes softening for just a moment. Then the orders came shouting from the pass, and the spell was broken. At his table, Alexander sat rigid, his mind spinning. He had built empires from glass and steel, commanded men twice his age, reduced competitors to ashes. But tonight, one pregnant waitress, one woman he had thrown aside, was unraveling him in front of an audience without speaking more than a handful of words. And for the first time in his gilded life, Alexander Pierce wasn't sure how to stop it. The dinner rush swelled. Waiters darted between tables, silver trays gleaming beneath chandelier light. Cutlery chimed against porcelain, and laughter swirled in golden waves. But beneath it all, tension pulsed like a second heartbeat, tethered to the table where Alexander Pierce sat, trapped in a theater of his own making. Olivia relished the stage. She leaned back in her chair, her sequined gown catching every flicker of light, and raised her voice just enough to carry. "Alex, darling," she drawled, gesturing toward Clara as she passed with a tray of steaming dishes. "You really must tell us. Was she as terrible at dusting as she is at walking straight with that belly?" Laughter erupted from a nearby table of young executives, eager to impress the millionaire. Their cruel delight rippled outward, infecting the room. Clara didn't slow. Her tray barely trembled. She placed the meals down at a family's table with her usual quiet grace, even thanking them for their patience. The little girl from earlier smiled up at her, slipping her a tiny origami crane folded from the menu paper. Clara's lips curved, just slightly, as she tucked it into her apron pocket. But when she straightened, her eyes flicked toward Olivia and Alexander. For a heartbeat, the mask slipped. Hurt glimmered through. Then she smoothed it away again. Marcus watched from the kitchen window, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. His fellow cooks whispered, half entertained, half appalled, as if they were watching a play they'd paid tickets for. "She's holding it together better than anyone could," muttered one. "Better than I would," Marcus growled. When Clara came back through the swinging doors, Marcus caught her arm gently. "You shouldn't have to swallow this." Clara shook her head. "If I react, I lose. That's what they want." Her voice was steady, but Marcus saw the tightness around her eyes, the tremor in her jaw. He knew her too well, knew the storms she hid behind stillness. "You're stronger than anyone in this room," he said almost fiercely. Clara's lips twitched, as though she wanted to believe him, but then Evelyn, the manager, barked for her to run drinks to table 12, and she was gone again. Alexander tried to laugh along with Olivia's jabs, but each word landed like a stone in his stomach. His eyes followed Clara across the restaurant. Every step she took seemed to tighten something inside him. Memories churned. Clara in his mansion, ironing quietly in the sunlit laundry room. Clara humming while scrubbing the marble floors. Clara's silence the day he fired her. He remembered the look on her face then. Not pleading, not angry. Just shattered. He'd buried it under excuses, protecting his image, keeping boundaries. But the truth had clawed its way to the surface tonight. He had fired her because she made him feel small, because in her at presence, he saw dignity that no money could buy, and he had hated her for it. The crowd's cruelty deepened. Olivia whispered loudly to a passing table of businessmen. "She's probably carrying the gardener's child. Isn't it tragic?" They chuckled nervously, glancing toward Alexander, gauging his reaction. Alexander's face stiffened. He wanted to shut her up. He wanted to tell the room that Clara was worth more than all of them combined. But the words choked in his throat, strangled by pride and the image he had spent years curating, so he said nothing. And his silence became complicity. It happened in an instant. Clara approached their table with a tray of glasses balanced in her hand. Olivia leaned back deliberately, her elbow jutting out. The corner of her sequined sleeve snagged the edge of the tray. The crash was deafening. Crystal shattered across the marble floor, shards skittering beneath chairs. Wine splashed crimson across Clara's apron and pooled at Alexander's polished shoes. The restaurant gasped as one. Conversations died. Every eye turned toward her. Clara froze, breathing shallow, glass glittering like stars at her feet. Olivia pressed a hand to her lips, feigning shock. "Oh no! Did I do that? These clumsy arms of mine, how careless of me!" Her tone was saccharine, her smirk unmistakable. The crowd tittered nervously. Evelyn stormed forward, heels clicking. "Clara! What on earth?" But before she could finish, Marcus burst through the kitchen doors, apron still tied, face blazing with fury. "It wasn't her fault!" His voice boomed across the restaurant. "She didn't drop it! You!" He jabbed a finger at Olivia. "You pulled that tray down!" Gasps rippled. Olivia's eyes widened, scandalized that a line cook dared address her directly. "Excuse me?" she hissed. But Marcus wasn't backing down. "You think this is entertainment? Humiliating a wow. Oman, who's working twice as hard as any of you here?" His chest heaved, his scarred hands clenched at his sides. "You don't deserve to lick the dirt off her shoes." Silence. Utter silence. The entire restaurant held its breath. And then, Clara spoke. Her voice was low, but it carried through the room like a blade cutting velvet. "Marcus, it's all right." She looked down at the glass, then at the faces surrounding her. Her own face was pale but fierce, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "They want a spectacle, but I won't give them that." She turned her gaze, finally, directly onto Alexander, and for the first time all night, her voice shook with the weight of everything she had buried. "You threw me away once like I was nothing. And now, you sit here and watch while they laugh at me. You haven't changed, Alexander." The name hung in the air like a verdict. Alexander's chest constricted. His mask cracked. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. All around them, the crowd leaned forward, the moment balanced on the edge of something none of them could quite predict. The restaurant was silent but for the hum of chandeliers and the faint hiss of the kitchen grills. Every eye was on Clara, standing among the shards of glass, wine staining her apron like blood on battle armor. Alexander's lips parted, his pale eyes searching hers, but the words that had come so easily in boardrooms and gala speeches now refused him. His throat was dry, his chest heavy. Clara's voice, trembling but clear, rose again. "You humiliated me once, in front of strangers. You made me believe I wasn't human enough to stand in your house, let alone look you in the eye." She placed a steadying hand over her belly, her breath uneven. "But I am done letting you or anyone else make me feel small." The crowd stirred, gasps, whispers, some murmurs of approval. Olivia scoffed loudly, breaking the fragile silence. "Oh, spare us the speech. You're a maid, Clara, a waitress now. Nothing's changed, except the belly you're dragging around. This entire restaurant is Woan. Watching you make a fool of yourself." Her laughter rang sharp against the walls, but it only sharpened Clara's spine. She stepped forward, shards crunching beneath her shoes, and locked her gaze on Alexander, not Olivia, not the crowd, him. "Look at me," she demanded. He did. You can't hide behind her laughter, or your money, or your silence. Her voice grew steadier with every word. "You fired me because you were ashamed. Ashamed that I was stronger than you in a house where I had nothing, and you couldn't stand it, so you threw me out." Alexander's hands shook around the edge of the table. Sweat prickled his brow. He tried to muster the calm mask he always wore, but it crumbled beneath the truth cutting from her lips. The diners were no longer whispering. They were listening. Clara pressed her palm harder against her belly, her shoulders trembling. "I may not have wealth or gowns or a name that makes people bow, but I have dignity. I have this child, and I will not—" Her voice cracked, then steadied, fiercer than before. "I will not let either of us bow to people who see us as less than human." The room exhaled. A woman near the back clapped once, softly, then another, until the sound spread like wildfire. Not applause of mockery, but solidarity. Evelyn, the manager, froze mid-step, caught between reprimand and astonishment as the crowd chose Clara's side. Marcus stood tall at the kitchen doors, pride blazing in his eyes. And Alexander's world shattered. He pushed back his chair, the scrape against marble jarring. His knees trembled as he stood. His pale face was flushed, his chest heaving like a man drowning on dry land. Olivia frowned, tugging his sleeve. "Alex, sit down. Don't—" But he yanked away from her grasp, his voice breaking raw and unvarnished. "She's right." The room gasped. Olivia blinked, stunned, her painted smile collapsing. Alexander's voice cracked louder now, unspooling with years of pride undone. "I fired her because I was weak, because she made me see something in myself I hated. She worked harder than anyone in my life, and I threw her out like trash because I cared more about how I looked in front of my friends than about her dignity." His breath hitched. His blue eyes glossed with tears he couldn't stop. "I destroyed her life that day, and tonight, I sat here and let it happen all over again." His knees buckled. And then, before anyone could believe it, Alexander Pierce, the man who built towers, who people bowed to in boardrooms, sank to the ground before a pregnant waitress. "Clara," his voice trembled. "I'm sorry." His hands shook as he lowered his head, tears dripping onto the marble. "I'm so damn sorry." The crowd's silence was thunderous. Olivia sat frozen, mouth agape, her perfect composure unraveling in horror. Evelyn shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of which side the room had turned toward. Clara stood rigid, breath shallow, staring down at the man kneeling at her feet. For years she had dreamed of this, some acknowledgement, some justice, some reversal of the humiliation that haunted her. And now here it was. But her heart twisted with something she hadn't expected. Pity. She drew in a shaky breath, her eyes glistening. "I don't want your apology, Alexander." Her voice was low but unyielding. "Not here. Not like this. What I want is for you to change, to treat people as people, to remember that money doesn't make you more human than the ones serving you." Her words cut sharper than glass. Alexander nodded through tears, unable to lift his gaze. "I will. I swear to you, I will." But Clara did not bend. She did not soften. She turned, lifting her chin high, and stepped past him, head held higher than it had ever been when she worked in his house. The crowd parted for her, silent, reverent. And Alexander Pierce remained kneeling in the wreckage of crystal and pride, his world split wide open for all to see. The restaurant buzzed with an energy no maitre d' could have orchestrated. Clara had walked past Alexander without breaking stride, her back straight, her belly forward, a quiet monument to survival, but her words still hung in the air, heavy and electric. Alexander remained kneeling, shoulders hunched, pale eyes wet, breath unsteady. Olivia's jeweled fingers gripped his sleeve, tugging sharply. "Get up," she hissed under her breath, though her voice carried. "You look pathetic." He didn't move. Gasps and murmurs swelled around the tables. A young couple near the bar whispered fiercely, "Did you see that? He admitted it." Another man muttered, "Pierce? Kneeling to a waitress?" Their shock rolled outward until the whole dining room seemed to tilt away from him. Olivia's face reddened under the chandelier glow. She rose abruptly, her chair screeching. "This is absurd!" Her voice cracked sharp and brittle. "She's milking this entire place for pity, and you—" She jabbed a manicured finger at Alexander. "You're embarrassing yourself, begging forgiveness from your maid, pathetic." The words didn't land as she intended. Instead of laughter, a low murmur of disapproval swept through the room. Diners frowned, some shaking their heads, others glaring openly at her. Clara, halfway across the restaurant, stopped at the service station to exchange her empty tray. Her hands shook faintly, but her face remained calm, unreadable. She heard every word, and she chose silence again. Not weakness this time, but power. Evelyn, the manager, stepped forward, her heels clicking like a metronome against the marble. She looked between Clara and Alexander, calculating the optics, the money at stake. "Mr. Pierce," she said crisply, "perhaps you'd like to continue your meal in private." But another voice cut across hers. "Leave her alone." It was Marcus. He stood at the kitchen doors, his arms crossed. Apron still flecked with oil and sauce, his eyes blazing. He strode forward, stopping beside Clara as though placing himself on the front line. This woman has worked herself to the bone every night, and all you people see is someone to mock. Well, not tonight. His voice thundered, reverberating through the chandeliers. You don't get to break her down for sport, not while I'm here. The room erupted, half gasps, half claps. Some of the diners cheered softly, others nodded in agreement. Clara turned her head, eyes meeting Marcus's. There was something unspoken there, something that made her throat tighten. Gratitude, maybe, or the memory of childhood evenings when he had stood beside her after schoolyard taunts. Alexander finally staggered to his feet, wiping his face with the back of his hand. His immaculate hair was mussed, his cufflinks glinted like iron restraints. He turned toward the room, pale eyes wide. She's right, he said hoarsely, his voice cracking. Everything she said. And if you laugh at her again— He looked directly at Olivia, his words trembling but fierce. Then you laugh at me, because I am the fool who threw away the only person who ever showed me dignity without asking for a damn thing in return. Gasps again. The entire restaurant leaned forward as though they might miss a single word. Olivia sputtered, Alex, what are you— But Alexander didn't sit back down. He stayed standing, his chest rising and falling, his face pale and raw. I built towers, deals, fortunes. But the truth? Not one of those things made me half as strong as she is. Clara Johnson deserves respect. And if you can't see that, then you're beneath her. The silence that followed was deafening. For once Alexander Pierce had no mask, no performance. Just truth, raw and ugly and unpolished, spilling into the air like a confession at an altar. Olivia's face twisted with fury. She snatched her clutch, the diamonds at her ears glittering harshly. You're insane! With that she stormed out, her heels hammering the floor. The heavy doors slammed behind her, and the sound echoed like a final gavel. Evelyn stood frozen, caught between damage control and awe. She glanced at Clara, then at the diners, who were now watching with something more dangerous than curiosity— admiration. She cleared her throat, her voice faltering. Clara, maybe you should take the rest of the evening off. But someone from the back called, No, let her stay. Another voice chimed in. She deserves better than this. Clapping broke out, not polite, but real. Clara's cheeks flushed. She stood still, holding her tray like a shield, overwhelmed. Marcus leaned close, his voice low enough for only her to hear. They're not clapping for Pierce, Clara. They're clapping for you. Her eyes burned. She blinked hard, fighting the tears that threatened. The night was far from over, but the tide had shifted. The crowd no longer saw Clara as invisible, no longer reduced her to her uniform. They saw the strength in her silence, the fire in her words, the dignity that had survived humiliation. And Alexander, once the untouchable millionaire, was left standing in her shadow, his empire of pride crumbling around him. The night unraveled into something no one in that glittering restaurant could have predicted. The applause tapered into a hum of conversation. Soft, reverent, but charged. Diners leaned over their tables, whispering Clara's name as though she had become a symbol, not just a server. Clara herself stood motionless, tray still at her side, her breath unsteady. She had endured years of invisibility, of being looked through, of being treated as background noise. And now, they were all looking at her. Really looking. Evelyn, the manager, adjusted her glasses nervously, caught between corporate instinct and something human stirring in her chest. Clara, she said carefully, you've shown restraint tonight. I'll see that you're compensated for the incident. Her words stumbled, as if the usual language of control no longer fit. But Clara shook her head. I don't want compensation. Her voice was steady, her eyes sharp. I want respect. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Alexander Pierce stood pale and rigid, his chest still heaving from the collapse of his pride. His cufflinks gleamed like manacles in the candlelight. He had built his life on control, on image, on always being above reproach. But now, the room that once looked at him with envy looked at him with something colder. Judgment. He stepped forward, but his steps lacked the authority they once carried. He looked at Clara, then at the crowd, and then back at Clara again. His voice was hoarse, but audible. "I was wrong," he said simply. Gasps again. Diners leaned forward. Alexander's gaze swept the room, trembling with shame. "You see a millionaire. You see a man with everything. But I've lived empty. Empty enough that the dignity of one woman threatened me, so I destroyed it." His throat tightened, his voice cracking. "That day I fired Clara. I thought I was protecting my image. The truth is I was terrified. Terrified that she had something I couldn't buy. And tonight, you've all seen it too." His eyes dropped, wet with tears. "She has strength. I don't." Silence weighed heavy. Clara's heart pounded. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let those words settle like balm over the scar he had left. But she had learned better than to let apologies rewrite history. "You can say that here," she said softly, though the room carried her words. "But it doesn't undo the years I spent feeling like less than a person because of you. Words don't change that." Alexander bowed his head, his blonde hair falling loose, his shoulders trembling. And for the first time, the crowd saw not a titan of real estate, but a man unraveling. Olivia was gone. The crowd had chosen sides. Evelyn fidgeted near the hostess stand, her loyalty suddenly uncertain. And Marcus stood tall at Maid. Clara's side, not touching her, not speaking, just present. His presence was steadying, like the roots of a tree bracing against storm winds. The moment stretched until it ached. Then an older gentleman at the far table rose slowly, his silver beard catching the light. He raised his glass toward Clara. "To dignity," he said solemnly. Others followed. One by one, glasses lifted across the room. "To dignity. To Clara." The refrain spread like a wave. Clara's lips parted, her chest tightening. She blinked hard, the tears finally breaking loose. The tray slipped from her hand and clattered onto the counter behind her. For once, she didn't pick it up. Marcus stepped closer, steadying her with the smallest brush of his hand against her elbow. "You've won," he whispered. Clara shook her head, voice low. This was never about winning. It was about being seen. And at last, she was. Alexander covered his face with his hand, tears sliding down his wrist. The man who once demanded respect by wealth now stood as nothing more than another guest, stripped of status, laid bare before the truth. The restaurant no longer revolved around him, it revolved around Clara. Evelyn cleared her throat again, but this time her voice softened. "Clara," she said, faltering, You've reminded us all tonight what matters. I'll speak to my partners. There's an opening at Stanton Cafe. We've been looking for a pastry assistant. I know you've always—" She hesitated, uncertain how much of Clara's dreams she knew. "I think you'd be perfect." Clara blinked, stunned. Her breath caught. The bakery dream she had tucked away like a relic of a younger, freer self was being unearthed in front of 100 strangers. Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with something warm and proud. The room applauded again, softer this time, less spectacle, more promise. And Clara, for the first time, on years, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could belong to her again. The restaurant emptied slowly, like the aftermath of a storm. Chairs scraped, voices softened, and the glittering chandelier above cast fractured reflections across tables abandoned mid-meal. Clara stood still, trayless now, her apron crumpled around her waist. The energy in her veins had not yet quieted. She felt both raw and unshakably alive. Marcus lingered nearby, his strong frame forming a quiet shield around her. He didn't speak right away. He knew better than to crowd her in this moment. His gaze was steady, as if he was watching her become someone she had always been meant to be. Alexander remained by the bar, shoulders hunched, his white shirt wrinkled with sweat, his cufflinks undone and forgotten. He had been silent since his public collapse, and for once silence seemed to suit him. The arrogance, the polished sheen, the practiced smirk, they were all gone. What remained was only a man who had to live with what he had done. Clara finally broke the stillness, her voice weary but certain. "I'm done here." The words startled Evelyn, who had been nervously fiddling with her notepad. "Done working tonight?" she asked. "No," Clara said, untying the apron from around her waist and folding it neatly onto the counter. Done serving tables for people who think they can decide what I'm worth. Her tone was calm, not dramatic, but it landed heavier than any slammed door. Marcus gave a small, approving nod. Evelyn blinked, torn between the reflex to scold and the dawning realization that scolding would mean nothing now. Clara stepped out from behind the counter, straightened her dress, and walked toward the door. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like each one rewrote a piece of her life. Marcus followed beside her, not leading, not pushing, just matching her stride. As she neared the door, Alexander finally stirred. His voice cracked through the dimmed room. "Clara, wait." She stopped but did not turn. The silence hung, filled with the weight of every choice that had led them here. He rose, shaky, and crossed the floor toward her. His expensive shoes clicked against marble, but the sound no longer commanded authority. He stopped just short of her, enough distance to show he understood he had no right to close the space. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, his blue eyes glistening. "But I need you to know, I'll carry the shame of tonight for the rest of my life. And maybe that's the justice I deserve." Clara finally turned to face him. Her eyes were swollen with tears she refused to shed again. She studied him, not with anger anymore, but with something colder. Finality. "Justice isn't about what you carry," she said softly. "It's about what I no longer have to." Her words landed like a verdict. She stepped past him, the faint scent of lavender and dish soap clinging to her as she passed. Alexander's knees buckled slightly. For a fleeting moment, it looked as if he might fall again. But no one rushed to help him. Outside, the night air wrapped around Clara like a balm. The sky was velvet black, stars scattered like spilled salt across the horizon. She inhaled deeply, the city's hum folding into something almost peaceful. Marcus stood beside her, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her closely. "You didn't just walk out of a restaurant," he said gently. "You walked out of a prison." Clara tilted her head, the corner of her mouth twitching into the smallest smile. "Feels that way." They walked together down the quiet street. The city lights flickered off puddles left by an earlier rain, each reflection distorted, beautiful in its imperfection. Clara's hand brushed her stomach, protective, tender. Marcus noticed and slowed his pace. "You ever gonna tell me who—" She shook her head, cutting him off. "That part doesn't matter anymore. What matters is, I get to decide what kind of world my child is born into. And tonight, I chose." Marcus nodded. Respectful silence. Days later, Clara stood outside Stanton Cafe, the little bakery Evelyn had mentioned. The windows glowed warm, filled with racks of golden bread and sugared pastries. The air carried cinnamon, butter, and the faint hum of morning chatter. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the door. Inside, the owner, a stout woman with kind eyes, greeted her with flour-dusted palms. "You're Clara?" she asked warmly. "Yes," Clara said, her voice carrying a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. "I'm here to work." And just like that, the dream she once buried beneath the weight of servitude began to breathe again. Weeks passed. The headlines of Alexander Pierce's public breakdown spread through whispers and articles. His empire trembled, not because of finances, but because respect was gone. He remained wealthy, yes, but when he walked into restaurants, no one looked at him the same way. Wealth had become his cage. Clara, meanwhile, rose with the sun each morning, her apron now one of flour and sugar rather than polyester and grease. She kneaded dough with hands that carried both labor and love. Customers began to know her by name. Some even recognized her from that night at the Mariner, whispering softly as if in awe. "That's the woman who stood up to him." But Clara never let it inflate her. She wasn't living for their awe. She was living for herself, and for the child who would one day know her not as a maid, not as a servant, but as a woman who refused to stay invisible. On a quiet Sunday morning, Marcus stopped by the cafe. He leaned against the counter, watching her dust-powdered sugar across fresh croissants. "You look at peace," he said. Clara smiled faintly, wiping flour from her cheek. "Peace tastes like cinnamon." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes when the weight of the world has shifted, if only slightly, toward justice. And in that little back, airy with the smell of sugar in the air and sunlight spilling across the counter, Clara finally felt what she had longed for all along. Not revenge, not applause, not even forgiveness. Freedom.